So this is a discourse from Aristophanes, the playwright Aristophanes, his play called Peace. And so I'll just speak for both of them. The servant asks, "What has happened to you?" And Tryggius says, "My legs pain me. It was such a damned long journey." "Oh, tell me about it." "What? Did you see any other man besides yourself strolling about in heaven?" "No, only the souls of two or three dithyrambic poets." Of course, the poets. "What were they doing up there?" "They were seeking to catch some lyric exordia," great word, "as they flew by immersed in the billows of the air. Is it true what they tell us, that men are turned into stars after death?" "It's quite true." "And who is the star over there now?" "Ion of Chios, the one who once wrote a poem about the dawn. As soon as he got up there, everyone called him the morning star. And those stars like sparks that plow up the air as they dart across the sky, they are the rich leaving the feast with a lantern and a light inside it." So, it's important to remember, and we'll talk more about Plato later on in this class, but it's important to remember that the idea of stars representing the souls of our ancestors or of the dead is not something which is just about the, quote unquote, indigenous thought. That this is also something which exists in Greek thought and Greco-Roman thought as well, and in Plato. And so this is situated, these same ideas are actually situated in what would be called the Western tradition, for lack of a better way of putting it. Scare quotes around that. Um, and I think when we see, especially with the Milky Way, how much things in even Greco-Roman thought are related to the cosmovisions and philosophies of the Americas, right? Of the first people of the Americas. We find it most palpably with the Orphics, I think. Um, we don't know what occurred in many of the mystery cults, but with what we have left, it would seem that the Orphics and their beliefs align most closely with so much of what we see across the planet. But of course, there's also a connection with ancient Egypt, and that's similar with Plato, who was thought to have studied in Egypt, and much of his thought, likely comes from this Egyptian ideas about the afterlife and about these broader cosmovisions. And I also just want to bookmark here in this discourse the importance of encountering poets in the afterlife, which is it's not just something that the Orphics talked about. There are many cultures, poets are the ones who are writing these kinds of discourses, and they're encountering other poets in these otherworldly journeys. And so it's just known, it's inherent, right, that poets are those who see into the other world and are able to bring something back. Poets, artists, musicians. But when we talk about Orpheus a little bit at the end of this, just remember how important it is, the relationship of poets with this vision of the afterlife and their place within that. So here we see what's called a lamella, and it's a very thin piece of gold which would have some writing on it, and the writing is sort of in the form of like a spell, sometimes more so than other times, and these would be found in around different parts of the body, sometimes near the mouth or the eyes, or near to the heart, but somewhere in close proximity to an important part of the person's body. And just like a tomb for many cultures, but I'm thinking especially of ancient Egypt, where the insides of coffins would be lined with all of these words and images, right? This is a guidebook for those on their afterlife journey, especially those who could afford to have these kinds of burials, right? Not everybody could afford to be buried with gold, and that's an important reminder. But for those who could afford this, something like this may be being a little easier, right, than an elaborate tomb structure. This is like a little guidebook for the soul to refer back to so that they know what direction to go, what gods to speak to, how to speak to them, etc., so that they can move to a more elevated position in the afterlife. And so scholars have studied these lamellas, and it's been interesting to see the different celestial imagery that is found in some of them. Like a lot of these things, it's not entirely agreed that this translates to celestial imagery, but I'm pretty convinced of it, and I think the scholar, at least the scholars that I've followed, that's their argument, and I'm in agreement, especially when it relates to ideas of the Milky Way, which feel as close to like universal or worldwide star lore as it gets in its importance for the afterlife journey of the soul. And I think the Orphics were no exception in this regard. So one of these lamellas had inscribed on it this the quote. Briefly, I'll read: "A ram, you fell into milk. A bull, you fell into milk. A kid," meaning a goat, "you fell into milk." And so some scholars have interpreted this as a kind of ritual instruction, perhaps relating to certain forms of sacrifice or ritual or the feeding of certain things to particular deities. But I think it's pretty strong. The argument is pretty strong that this aligns with the constellations that you would probably guess it relates to, which is a ram for Aries, a bull for Taurus, and then a kid is actually a reference to Auriga, and the charioteer who holds the little goat, um, and the star Capella specifically would be that little goat, and that star had important significance for the ancient Greeks and the Orphics in particular in relation to this kind of afterlife journey, which we can see on a few different funeral stelae in Greece. This reference to Capella, or the kid, the little goat, in relation to this afterlife. And so, without going deeper into Capella, because that's its own separate thing, because we're talking about the Milky Way right now, there's also this notion, which I think some of you may also be familiar with, of drinking from a river of remembrance and a river of forgetfulness, the river of Lethe in the Greek underworld. And so, if the night sky, as I've been proposing in this class, and as that I would say all of these cultures that I've been talking about are also not proposing, but very much abide by. If the night sky is a kind of analog for the other world, the underworld, even the land of the dead, if the stars in the night sky are the lights of our ancestors, then many of the things that we see in underworld, in these kinds of visions of what the underworld looks like, the maps of Hades, if you will, have their analogs in the night sky. And so these rivers that, like the river Styx, etc., in the Greek vision of the underworld, would potentially have their analogs within the night sky. And of course, if the Milky Way is the river of the other world and in the sky, then we would look to the Milky Way. And so I want you to pay attention to this because we'll talk about a few examples, but the Great Rift, and you can see in this diagram here the stars that are that fall along it. But the Great Rift is this split, which if you look at the milk in the Milky Way, which would be the water, or the liquid, or even the pathway that the soul would be traveling along, if they're coming from where, let's say they entered the pathway on the stars of Orion, which if you remember the Mississippian culture, those stars were imaged by a hand with an eye in it. And the deity for that culture, for certain people who are able to pass typically along the winter solstice, there's that winter solstice crossing point again. The hand would extend out and the soul would go onto the hand and the hand would pull them onto the Milky Way. And then that soul would begin journeying on the road of the Milky Way. So if we imagine that from the left here, that soul is journeying, walking on its path in the afterlife, and then it reaches about here, marked by the star Deneb, also where you see funnel cloud and the northern coal sack. But specifically here, right at about this point where we see the liquid of the Milky Way, we begin to see this split, which is called the Great Rift. And if we follow this crossroads, right, or the split in the river on either side, so one direction, if you can follow my mouse for a moment, one direction takes us past where just below Vega, and we follow it, and then it peters out, it dissolves out over here. It ends. You could imagine that that river goes to a waterfall and then it hits land or it dries out or something like that. And then if we look at the other direction, it goes and it goes, it loses a little bit of its liquid. So let's say maybe it slows down a little bit here. You know, you don't see as many star clusters. It's not as bright. But then just as we're moving towards the star Altair, we keep going, and eventually we return back to the ecliptic. And this is the teapot is actually Sagittarius. If you weren't aware, in the modern constellations, it's sometimes looked at as a teapot, which is really funny to me that Sagittarius is a teapot. And then just past here, we would see Scorpius, just beyond these trees. But it's important, right, that we entered in this crossing over here with the stars around Orion, and that was where the Milky Way crossed with the ecliptic. Remember, if we go back right where Gemini and Taurus between Gemini and Taurus, we would go onto the Milky Way, and then we go and we arch above and we come down. And then if we stay on the river, eventually we reach the ecliptic once again to that crossing point between Sagittarius and Scorpius. So if the ecliptic is that kind of habitable zone of life that we're all familiar with, right? This arched body of the goddess Nut of the Milky Way, she then returns us back if we're able to stay on that pathway, if we're able to keep paddling on the river, right? We can eventually make it back into the habitable zone. But what happens what happens if we don't? What happens if we take like that person standing at the crossroads at the beginning of the presentation? What happens if we just keep going? So I think, and I didn't see this explicitly, but I'm sure some scholar has talked about this. But this is taking this direction on the Milky Way Road is like drinking from the river of forgetfulness of Lethe, right? And so the soul drifts off into the endless expanse, the infinite expanse of the night sky, and just dissolves into a kind of nothingness as it just flows back into everything else that already exists. But here, right, here is perhaps the path of reincarnation or remembering or even of the elevation of the soul, right? If we stay on the path, this is where we drink from the river of remembrance. And so the Orphic lamellas were about getting the initiate to remember who they are as an initiate and to drink from the river of remembrance specifically. This is what the spells on these were a reminder for. And actually the tombs or the sarcophaguses in the Egyptian pyramids for those who could afford, or in the Egyptian burial sites, were similarly about having the soul be able to remember who they are as an initiate and to be able to navigate this path specifically around remembrance so that they could be not devoured into, into nothingness on the other side. If everyone's still with me, I haven't seen a single question, so I hope that means you are all wonderfully engaged in what I think is some of the best material So I told you that I would mention Plato, and one of his more well-known myths or stories comes from the myth of air, which is actually at the end of Plato's Republic. And so the Platonic myths are situated within these dialogues, right, where Socrates is the interlocutor with someone else, and he Socrates is describing the near-death experience of this figure named Air. Excuse me, I'm just gonna have a little sip of water. And Air in his near-death experience, he witnesses. There's a whole. I encourage you just to read it yourself because it's a much more extensive vision. But one thing that he witnesses, the waters of ascension and descension. So waters moving upward and waters moving downward. The crossroads of the afterlife, as well as the lots that souls choose for their next incarnation. So he's seeing souls on in the other world pick who they're going to be and what their destiny is going to be when they reincarnate in this world. But I'm wondering, just as I, reflect on this, right, that these rivers, these waters of ascension and descension, could this be the same as the Milky Way crossing points that we've been describing? I think there's something to that, but this is just my own question that I'm asking. This is another image of the Great Rift where you can see, I think the exposures for longer in the photograph and the contrast is bumped up. So you can see this point of divergence where it just kind of dissolves up here, right? The upper portion. And here is the star Deneb, that very bright star, which is the tail star of Cygnus. And this marks that crossroad point, right? Where when the soul chooses between the path of obliteration of their memory and drinks from the river of forgetfulness or continues on the path, perhaps as you can see it converging with the horizon here, perhaps back into incarnation. I'm not saying yes or no. We're just talking about these different ideas. Here we see the same rift in the Milky Way that I've shown you multiple images of. We're in Deneb, which is the tail star of Cygnus, is found. And so this proposed constellation of this man-eating being for the Mesopotamians would be about here, which I think is important when we're talking about this divide, which one direction leads to kind of nowhere or to dissolution, let's say, and then the other direction leads perhaps to reincarnation or perhaps into some kind of ghostly existence back onto the planet. It depends on the cosmology that you're looking at. But importantly, um, somewhere around here, there's this bird-like or winged-like being for a lot of different cultures that eats people, splits them in half, does something gnarly to them, wherein the soul has to make a decision where it's judged and goes one direction or the other. And the constellations and the stars that are found in this part of the sky are called the summer triangle, right? With the Milky Way just going right through. So they form the three birds or three bird constellations because Lyra has also been thought of as a kind of vulture. One of the older names is Vultur cadens, the falling vulture, which is the Latin name for it, and Vega is a star. All of these stars are associated heavily with birds. And so I don't know if you saw me post about this class on social media or if you get into your own kind of archaeological rabbit holes or even conspiratorial type of thinking. But there was a site discovered, how long ago was it? Maybe like, has it been a decade now? Called Göbekli Tepe in modern day Turkey. And the most famous stone pillar at Göbekli Tepe has what is called it's called the vulture stone. And this is an image of the vulture stone. And I'm going to talk more about the vulture stone next class because this is incredibly important when we're talking about very, very ancient ideas about the afterlife journey, as well as what once again, shamans, for lack of a better way of calling them, were doing with this travel to the other world, this astral travel to the other world. Göbekli Tepe is dated to roughly like 10 to 12,000 BCE. Um, and this being is sometimes called the vulture shaman because this head looks like a mask to many. And people have speculated, I mean, so many different things in relation to this stone. So we don't have enough time to talk about all the different ideas that people have had, some better than others. But many think that this is just like we saw with the Maya world tree with the scorpion at the bottom and the bird, the great monstrous bird at the top. Many think that this could be something akin to this, right? Where the scorpion here is actually the constellation we think of as Scorpius, going all the way back to 14,000 years ago. And then there are a collection of bird-like constellations, as well as potentially either a very bright star or something else, which I'll talk about next time. You'll just have to tune in next time to learn about that. But we're seeing many of these constellations that we're still familiar with from the same part of the world to this day. And so one of the reasons that people associate this with the afterlife journey is because funeral rituals for a variety of cultures clustering around this part of the world, the Near East, even going to the Far East and to the Himalayas. This is a sky burial practiced in Tibet and Nepal, wherein corpses would be left out and then carrion birds would come and eat the flesh of these bodies that were left out. And then it was thought that these birds would then take the soul of the person, up into the sky world and into the afterlife. And so, shamans in their otherworldly travel were doing something similar to what the vulture was doing in these kinds of sky burial-like structures, where they were able to take the human soul, whether that's, the soul of another or their own, and travel into the sky world or up this tree, as we've seen with the Maya, or down the tree into the underworld, and take the soul as a bird would, specifically as a vulture. Something a little closer to the Near East would be um, the Zoroastrian version, which is called the Tower of Silence, where, but similarly, bodies would be left out for carrion birds to come and devour the flesh and then fly away. And so this is an idea that's not isolated, right? It was actually something that was very strongly practiced all across the East, and I'm sure in other parts of the world that I haven't looked into yet. And so if you recall that dialogue that we looked at in ancient Greece, wherein the poets were seen in the afterlife, right? And the poets are the ones who have this connection to the other world and are the ones who are able to describe the other world. Lyra, or the star Vega, excuse me, um, this is the instrument of Orpheus. And I think it's just an appropriate way to end in describing the swan that is also Cygnus, right? As being related to Orpheus, and then we have the lyre, and this cluster of stars here being particularly Orphic in nature. And so when we're talking about a descent into the underworld, which the Orpheus myth is based around, as well as we saw earlier, the Orphics and their cosmological beliefs were also based around the importance of the memory and remembering who one is as they enter this afterlife journey. Well, the means of doing this would be through the power of art, poetry, music, beauty, right? And so these stars are intimately linked with this descent into the other world, as we see here at the path of the Milky Way, and that there's something important about how beauty, how poetry, how music, how art, how images relate to this kind of remembrance, right? Where if you are a soul traveling in the afterlife and you're at that crossroads point, encountering that great monstrous being, whatever they may look like, some huge bird or crocodile, that when you're asked what path you're going to take, or when your soul is judged, that like Orpheus, you are able to enter the afterlife um, using your poetry and your images and your song and your ability to be able to sway the gods to let them let them so that they'll let you through the gate on the other side so that they may be swayed.